Okay, so let's talk about money and the U.S. Constitution. Things to remember. Article 1, Section 8. Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin. And we didn't put this in before, but hopefully you've read it. To provide for the punishment of counterfeiting of securities and current coin of the United States. So that's what the government can do. Remember that Section 8 is the powers of Congress. So Congress can coin money, regulate the value of and a foreign coin. Section 10 of the Constitution is what states cannot do. Section 9 is what Congress cannot do. There's no money thing in there. Section 10 says no state shall coin money, so the states can't make money, emit bills of credit. That's basically printing up money that's a bond. In the modern world, if the government wants to borrow money, which it does every month, it borrows tens of billions of dollars every month, there's a well-developed financial system it can go to. It can go to Wall Street. It can deal with a variety of different ways of funding itself. Back in the 1700s, there isn't this well-developed financial system in the United States. In some ways, there's barely a financial system in the United States. So frequently what governments, state governments did, and governments, U.S. government before the Constitution did, is to print up what looks like money, but is really a bond, and it might come due, it might pay interest, but it's really looks like money. It's just not money. It's you loaning the government money. You buy that pill essentially, and you have money, but it's a bill of credit. It's a bond essentially. The state shall not make anything but gold or silver coin a tender in the payment of debts. You have to pay your state in gold and silver coin. Make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Okay. So, before la Constitución, money came from states. So I have a little couple coins from states up there, Massachusetts. I have a 20 shilling bill from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania from 1777, and I have an 8-pence note from Massachusetts as well in 1784. So you have state money, bills of credit as well, but it's the states that are putting the money out into circulation prior to the Constitution. And of course the British. And one of the things that happens that's kind of a driver in why there's the revolution is that the British try to get rid of colonial money and make us Americans use their money. So there's something of a fight. We already talked about the Spanish silver dollars. It's important to understand that the world was a lot more flexible in some ways. And again, the average person was a farmer. You might go your whole life and never touch a coin. Never touch something, $10 or $20. You might never do that in your entire life. You might trade tobacco leaves and cattle and deer. You might not ever do this. But from the 1700s up until the mid-1850s, when Congress bans it, it's this Spanish silver dollar is the most used coin in the United States. Mined in Mexico, minted in Mexico, and kind of a worldwide currency. You could use them all over Europe. You can use them in the United States. You can use them everywhere you want. Here's a couple examples of U.S. Treasury coins. Liberty coin 1795, a silver dollar from 1799. You notice that our currency says liberty on it. And again, I'm not picking on the "In God We Trust," but people make a big deal of that sometimes. The idea that we say "under God" in the Pledge of Allegiance happened in the Eisenhower administration in the 1950s, and the permanent use of reference to God on our money only started under Eisenhower. So in previous decades and previous centuries, we might have put some religious symbolism on our money, but it only became a permanent thing in the 1950s. This is a picture of the first bank of the United States. You watched your little video on central banks, and you know that we have the Federal Reserve now. We had two banks of the United States. This is in Philadelphia. It's still there. It's a national historical site. I've never seen it, but you could go see it if you felt like it. If you wanted to be the federal government and you wanted to get people to pay their taxes and do all this other stuff, and again, most people probably didn't pay taxes because the federal government's running off of tariffs and a few excise taxes. How do you pay in the old days? Well, you would go to the bank. So it made sense. The federal government could have licensed and did license banks across the country to accept deposits of people. So you could walk into the bank and say, hey, I have to pay $10 in taxes, and you could give it to the bank, and the bank would give you the credit for it and put it in the government's account. But the other easier way to do that is to put these banks all across the United States. So there's two. It's because the reason there's two is that they had charters, and those charters expired. So the first bank had a charter, it expired. Congress puts in a second bank with a limited charter, and it's going to expire. So in 1819, Congress puts a branch of the Bank of the United States in Maryland. And Maryland objects to this federal bank being there. So they pass a law that puts a steep tax on this bank, which ends up being fought out at the Supreme Court in a case called McCulloch versus Maryland in 1819. McCulloch was the branch manager of the bank in Maryland. The Supreme Court says that, in fact, Congress has the power to create a corporation. Now, you should know that in the Constitutional Convention, they argued about whether Congress should have the power to create a corporation, and they didn't include it in the Constitution, but since it's not there, they can, and the government's created lots of corporations over the years. And then, two, Congress has the power to create a bank. Because Congress has the power to regulate the value of money, if they deem a bank as a necessary tool to regulate the value of money, that falls under the Necessary and Proper Clause. It's a law that Congress deems as necessary and proper to carry out one of its functions. So essentially, we're saying that the Constitution does, in fact, have implied powers in it. And then the Supreme Court goes on, and this is a unanimous decision. This is not a 5-4, this is a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court that the state has no power to tax the federal government. The state and the feds are separate. They don't tax each other. So the state of Maryland cannot tax the federal government. We live here in Nevada. The state of Nevada is more than 90% federal land. We cannot tax the federal government for its land. So even though Nevada is a huge state, we're very property tax poor because most of the state is not taxable. At the same time, federal government can't tax state government bonds. So if you buy a Thomas and Mack bond that's issued by UNLV, the income you get from that bond is not subject to your federal income tax. Different levels of government cannot tax each other. And this decision, the Supreme Court decision, creates a great line. It's one of the often quoted lines in the world, and it says, the power to tax is the power to destroy. So Congress has the power to coin money and create this bank and do all these things. Maryland cannot use its taxing power to destroy something it could not otherwise ban. It can't force the federal government. The state cannot force the federal government to get rid of the bank, and they can't indirectly force the federal government to do something by taxing them. The power to tax is the power to destroy. This decision has immense application across history. It's quoted over and over and over and over again by the Supreme Court because it says the necessary and proper, puts in place the idea of the necessary and proper, and sets out guidelines for federalism between the feds and the states and so on. It also essentially brings in the Democratic Party. There were the Federalists and the Democrat-Republicans at the beginning. The Federalists die off. The Whigs start up, which is name of a party from England. The Democratic Party is started essentially by Thomas Jefferson, and the first president who's a member of the Democratic Party is Andrew Jackson, and they take offense to McCulloch versus Maryland. They don't believe that all these implied powers are there. The Democratic Party is founded to go against this idea of McCulloch versus Maryland, that all these implied powers exist. Jefferson did not believe the government had the power to create a corporation or a bank. And what's going to happen is that Andrew Jackson is going to let the Second Bank of the United States die. When its charter ends, he's just going to let it die. So now the United States is not going to have a central bank. It's going to have a bunch of state banks, banks that are chartered by states, but no central bank. So here's some quotes from McCulloch versus Maryland. Let the ends be legitimate. Leave it be within the scope of the Constitution. And all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adopted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consistent with the letter and the spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. So unless it's prohibited, we can do it. Thomas Jefferson is, well, he's still alive at this point, so he's not rolling over in his grave, but he's forming a political party to say, no, it's not what we meant. The government of the Union, though limited in its powers, is supreme within its sphere of action, and its laws, when made in pursuance of the Constitution, form the supreme law of the land. So this is the first time that the Supreme Court makes it clear that the federal laws trump the state laws or local laws. And they also go on to say, look, the federal government represents the entire country, so what the federal government does is presumed to be the will of the people of the country, and no state has the right or ability to contradict the will of all the people. What happens in the United States after that? We get something called free banking. And what happens is most of the money that exists in the United States from 1837 to 1863 is printed by banks. Banks can print their own money. Free banking era. You'll find a lot of very conservative, very right-wing people who think that this is great and we should go back and do it again. And then other people fly in terror when they talk about this. And again, it's because Andrew Jackson refused to renew the charter of the Second Bank of the United States. So now the federal government has no bank, and it has no way to really control the monetary system of the country. And the response is that states are going to authorize banks to print their own money. So here's some pictures. If you're really excited, we have the Mad River National Bank. And we have, sometimes this is referred to as wildcat banking because some of the pictures on the bills were pretty wild, a wild game. So we have the Farmers and Exchange Bank for South Carolina. We have the Bank of Manchester with a little George Washington on it. banks printing their own money. Well, they didn't have checking accounts. There were not checking accounts back then. If you went to your bank and you got a loan from the bank, they're going to give you cash. And maybe, just maybe, if it's the middle 1800s, they're going to print that cash up. Okay? Supposedly, they're going to have gold or silver on deposit at somewhere, and but you and I all know that that's just not the way it's going to work, right? And a lot of these bills are going to get printed up that have nothing at all behind them.